Emma, let's talk about the Western monarchs and the impact that weather has on them. It's been a really big season for atmospheric rivers out west. Tell me a little bit about the process of counting monarchs and when you start that process and where you are right now with that.
Every fall, we have community scientists and partners spread out from Mendocino County, California, all the way down the Pacific coast into northern Baja, Mexico, go out to places that we know monarchs are found overwintering typically. And if we hear reports, we go out to new sites and anywhere that we see monarchs clustering, we try to get a report and a count of how many butterflies were there following a protocol. And this project has been running for 26 years before we had terms like citizen science or community science. So it's really a testament to this long running dedication by many volunteers to get up early with binoculars, go count butterflies. And there's really two main periods of the year that we count the monarchs, and they give us a snapshot of how large the population is. The first is the Thanksgiving count, which happens on a 3-week period centered around the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. And then we have a second smaller count that happens right around New Year's. And so together we kind of get a sense of how many butterflies showed up early in the winter and then how many of them made it through at least midwinter.
It sounds crazy, but for somebody who has no knowledge of this, I'm very curious how one counts butterflies. It seems to me like trying to count a bunch of children running around on a playground. Are they not flying all over the place? Do you literally just count with your fingers?
That's a great analogy, and that's why we often come back to folks when they turn in a data sheet to us and say, "Okay, I saw 80 butterflies flying." I think we can all say if you tried to count 80 children running, you would not get a very accurate count. So that's why we have people go out early in the morning, because if it's cold and or dark, the butterflies are not able to warm up enough and fly. So they're way easier to count if they're stationary, and then they group together, which is really convenient. And so then it becomes a little bit more like counting jelly beans in the jelly bean jar. And so it's a lot about estimation skills. And it's why we really like to have volunteers go through training, go out with a buddy, and do this for many, many years, because you get the eye and you start to really know that's what 200 butterflies looks like. That's what 2,000 butterflies look like. So it's actually kind of a simple, low tech way of counting animals. And we've had some folks try to make it a little bit more impressive by using um, LiDAR or using photographs. And I have to say, so far, we still kind of come back to like binoculars and a buddy come up with as accurate as a count as any of the more high tech ways that we have for counting monarchs.
So the times of year when you count them, they kind of line up with the start of the atmospheric river season. So we're talking like end of November, beginning of December. What are you finding? And I know you're still counting, but what are some preliminary results you're getting in from this year?
Yeah, our Thanksgiving count results we announced recently, and they were wonderful because we hit over 300,000 monarchs, which is a massive number of butterflies just in and of itself. And compared to the last few years, that's really a high mark. But we always caveat that with the fact that even in parts of the 90s and definitely the 80s, we saw an order of magnitude more butterflies. So we were seeing low millions. So this is relatively not a lot of butterflies, but it's still really impressive. So we know we had a relatively good year, the fact that we saw that many at Thanksgiving, but the atmospheric river started just after these heavy storms hit right after that number hit. So we're not quite sure yet what that means. And that's where that second count will come in and help us get a better picture. But typically we see a loss of about a third to half the monarchs between the two count periods. So we expect that some of them are maybe just moving on and moving out and dispersing, but many of them probably die over the winter. So we expect when we had such an extreme winter storm season in California this year that we're going to see much higher rates of mortality just because of those wet, cold conditions. And we saw a lot of reports of trees down, including like major trees that butterflies were in. So they can fly, they can move. We don't expect like mass mortality from like a tree fall, but over time, that's the sort of interaction between kind of climate, weather, climate change, habitat, and a declining species where we really worry about these compounding effects when the population's already really small.
Are they endangered?
They are endangered according to like international standards by the IUCN, which does not have any legal weight. Within the US, they are a candidate species for endangered or threatened status. So we expect that the US Fish and Wildlife Service will list them sometime in the next 1 to 2 years.
And why are they important? Why is it important to have monarchs around?
Yeah, I love this question because I like to like turn it around to anyone who grew up anywhere in the lower 48 states, because you probably have some sort of childhood memory of monarchs. Like it's one of the most beloved insects, and it's certainly one that I think, are really ingrained in our classrooms and people have those personal connections to because they're everywhere. They're in urban areas, they're in rural areas, and then they migrate and have this incredible story of metamorphosis and migration. So just the cultural impact of these butterflies alone, I think, is really large. I think when it comes to kind of their ecological role, we know that most of their eggs and caterpillars don't make it to become adult butterflies, and that means they become food for other insects, birds, vertebrates. So there's a lot of like food web pieces as just food, as bugs, and they're a good flagship, I think, for like our larger insect and biodiversity crisis. And then actually economically, definitely certain smaller towns along the coast, Pacific Grove, Pismo Beach, both come to mind in California, where there's actually pretty significant amount of ecotourism, where thousands or even 100,000 visitors come to some of those really big sites every year to experience the magic of the butterflies, and they don't have to go all the way to Mexico to see that.
So what can we do to help the monarchs? Do you need more volunteers? Are there other things that citizens can do to help?
This is also one of those fun things because monarchs are everywhere. Pretty much everyone can contribute. One of the best things this time of year as spring approaches is that monarchs are going to be on the move. So we like to tell anybody who wants to report when they see a monarch, especially the first one of the year. That's a really important event when we track their migration. We track the size of that population that made it through the winter. So you can report to platforms like iNaturalist, which is free and has an app for iPhones or Android, and has a website. So you just need a photo of what you see and you can upload where you saw it and when. That's the easiest way I think people can help, and even you can get kids involved. If you have access to a garden or a lawn, or you have influence over how a school or business might garden, thinking about things like incorporating more native plants, incorporating native milkweeds, which are the food their caterpillars rely on and also smell great and are beautiful and attract many other bugs. Those are great ways to help. Planting blooming flowers that provide nectar, doing things like supporting wildlife legislation and funding for programs that are trying to incorporate more plants and animals in our landscapes are great ways people can help.
Going back to weather, I'm curious about other types of weather that may impact the monarchs, good or bad.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of active debate and conversations among the monarch crowd about like what events lead to like the perfect, what's the recipe for the perfect monarch year. So I think there are a lot of pieces, and it's complicated because of the scale of their migration. They're in so many places at once. So when you're thinking about like rainfall in Boise, is that more important than what the temperatures were like in March in Sacramento, for example? So there's just a lot of pieces, but we definitely know weather is driving these year-to-year variations, and it's driving it in ways that I think we have yet to fully unravel. But things like drought, especially kind of mega droughts and repeated droughts, we know can really impact the plants and the trees they rely on. Wildfire risks have kind of manyfold because actually milkweed loves wildfire and does really well and isn't great at competing with grasses. So when we see wildfires go through an area that are grassland, that can actually benefit the monarchs, which is kind of a funny thing. But when we see that same wildfire maybe affect the trees that they rely on in the winter, that's not such a great thing. So weather is definitely a major factor when it comes to monarchs, but whether any one event or place and time, it really depends on how those all interact.
It sounds like you guys are studying it though, the impacts of these weather events.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really an interesting conversation because this is where you get a 1,000 little pieces of data when you talk to community scientists, where they say, here's what I saw. This is how it affected monarchs, in my backyard. There was a strong wind event and now they're gone, or it was really, really hot and all the caterpillars on the plants died, things like that. So you kind of start to hear how people are locally realizing what weather is doing to monarchs, in their own backyard.
So when are you going to have the results for this next round of counting?
Yeah, in just a couple weeks, the New Year's count wrapped up. So we're just kind of tracking down the last little bits of data, but in the next couple of weeks, we should have a better sense. The one thing that's a little bit interesting of the weather also affected people in this case. So because those power outages, the flooding, Just so much that was going on during those atmospheric rivers. A lot of our volunteers could not get out to count their normal sites. So unfortunately, we expect that we'll have less of a clear sense of what that seasonal decline is just because we had a lot of volunteers impacted directly as well.
Interesting. Wow. All right. Well, that's all I have, unless you have anything else you want to add.
One thing people can do is reduce their reliance on pesticides, especially taking a look at labels of anything that you maybe use around your yard to, for purely aesthetic purposes, like keeping your rose leaves free from nibbles from Japanese beetles. So trying to get people to think through the low hanging fruit when it comes to reducing our reliance on chemicals that harm monarchs and other insects.
I like that. Low hanging fruit. Very good. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Emma. This was great. I really appreciate it.